You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the globe to bring you the latest developments in medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja.
We love the herb.
It's time for the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville. Now, here's your host, Russ Belville.
Good day, tokers and tokettes and non-toking lovers of liberty. It is Monday, October 30th, 2017, and it's got to be 420 somewhere in the world. Hope y'all had a great Halloween weekend. If you've been checking out my social media feeds at Radical Russ, you can see I had 2 different Halloween parties to go to this week, and it was a lot of fun. I was the Kurgan from the 1986 movie Highlander, and in total, 2 people recognized my costume. 2 people in total recognized my costume, which is fine. I like picking obscure 30-year-old movie movie costumes that nobody recognizes. It's fun for me. So you can also check out the photos. I'll have them uploaded soon, plus photos from my previous Halloween costumes all across time on my Radical Russ Flickr feed. It's a brand new thing that I'm trying out. Photos.radicalruss.com. I'll take you to the Flickr wall, and I've also got some of my childhood pics up there at this point. We're still trying to convert over from Google Photos after they got rid of the awesome Picasa and turned it over to this lousy Google Photos. We'll get that all together for you, and we'll have all sorts of media available. Making a few other changes here at the show as well, because I had originally scaled back the show to be a half hour, and I've found that it kind of just naturally goes longer than that. It naturally goes about 45 minutes. So we're just going to make that official. We're going to make this show 45 minutes long and see how well that shapes out for the next few weeks. So let me know what you think. You can always reach me at Radical Russ or through the mjagenda.com page. You can leave comments there if you like. Now, coming up on today's show, it's time for our Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. We're going to go back to the archives from April when President Trump was first talking about this opioid crisis to see what things were like back then and if things have changed any now that we've had a few more months of Trump in office. So that's coming up. We've also got for you a new segment that we're going to do after the cannabis headline news every day now called What in the News, which is my ability to talk about the news without having to just read it by script. And then we'll have time for a radical rant at the end. So stay tuned. It's coming up next on the Marijuana Agenda.
This is your Cannabis Headline News. Brought to you by MarijuanaMoment.net, the complete source for all your marijuana news in one morning newsletter from Marijuana Majority Founder Tom Angel. Subscribe today for free at MarijuanaMoment.net.
This is your Cannabis Headline News for Monday, October 30th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville. Montel Williams has filed suit in federal court in Miami against several corporate entities relating to claims of fraudulent online CBD oil scams that are deceiving consumers. The complaint alleges that the defendants, many of whom are believed to have acted together, engaged in an elaborate online scheme that involved, among other things, lifting the contents of a Forbes article about Mr. Williams' public advocacy for medical cannabis since his diagnosis with multiple sclerosis in 1999, and repurposing that content on sham websites and in social media that misappropriated Mr. Williams' name and likeness to fraudulently claim he endorsed their CBD oil. Consumers were then asked to sign up for a free trial that turned out to be anything but free, locking consumers into an automatic monthly credit card billing scheme with no clear way to cancel. Quote, "It's important to remember that these scams are anything but victimless. They are, in fact, calculated to prey on vulnerable consumers, many of whom have chronic illness or other disabilities," said Jonathan Franks, spokesman for Montel Williams. Continuing, quote, "As explained in the complaint, we heard from elderly customers and veterans on fixed incomes who incurred unexpected overdraft fees as a result of these scams," end quote. The Chicago Tribune reports that alcohol giant Constellation Brands is making a foray into marijuana, a precedent-setting move for an industry that has mostly stayed on the sidelines during the cannabis boom. Constellation will pay about $191 million for a 9.9% stake in Canopy Growth Corporation, a Canadian seller of medicinal marijuana products. The deal kicked off the biggest rally in nearly a year for Canopy, which trades on the Toronto Stock Exchange under the ticker WEED. The legalization of marijuana in Canada and a growing number of U.S. states is opening up a huge potential market, just as demand for alcohol is slowing. Still, pot remains prohibited at the U.S. federal level, meaning American companies have to tread carefully. Constellation, based in Victor, New York, and known for the Corona beer brand, said it has no plans to sell cannabis in the U.S. or other markets until it's legal, quote, at all government levels, end quote. In a recent interview, Senator Cory Booker denounced the stereotype of the lazy stoner while revealing that, quote, many legislators, end quote, that he's spoken to have smoked pot. Quote, I know in casual conversations in the Congress, many legislators who've done pot themselves. This pejorative pot smoker label doesn't fly, Booker said, as reported by Marijuana Moment. So many Americans have used marijuana or have no judgment for people that do. It's like saying, oh, those alcohol drinkers. We are a great society, a decent society, a good society, but our criminal justice laws do not reflect the heart of America, and we have got to do something about that, end quote. Ohio Supreme Court Justice Bill O'Neill announced Sunday afternoon his plans to run for governor, promising he would legalize marijuana for adult use. O'Neill, age 70, is prohibited from running for the court next year because of his age, according to the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Ohio has an age limit of 70 on justices running for the high court. He is the fifth Democrat to enter the race to replace term-limited Republican Governor John Kasich. O'Neill promised numerous marijuana law reforms, including legalizing recreational marijuana and taxing it to the tune of $200 million per year, releasing all nonviolent marijuana offenders, and using savings from prosecuting marijuana-related crimes and from taxing legalized marijuana to fund $325 million toward a mental health network. With only a few months left in office, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie will soon need a new job, but he is not interested in being President Trump's so-called drug czar. Christie has been very outspoken about the dangers of opioid abuse and has appeared in television public service announcements to promote treatment for addiction. But he also served as the head of Trump's task force on drugs. But during an exclusive interview with Good Day New York co-hosts Lori Stokes and Rosanna Scotto, reported by Fox 5 New York, Christie said he does not want to be the director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Why not? Quote, because one, I've done 16 years of public service, Christie said, and I think I can do a lot from the outside, end quote. This has been your Cannabis Headline News for Monday, October 30th, 2017. I'm Russ Belville.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hi, I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. If you appreciate my full-time dedication to reporting and analyzing the news about cannabis, consider becoming a patron of the show. For just $4.20 per month, you'll help keep my live stream and podcast free while earning yourself your own private ad-free podcast link for the show, as well as links to the supporting articles and data. For a $9.99 VIP subscription, you'll get all that plus my exclusive research, data tables, and graphics. Just log on to mjaddenda.com and click the Become a Patron button today.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Looking for the 420 friendliest way to visit beautiful legal Potland, Oregon?
I'm Lori Duckworth, inviting you to come stay with us at Delta 9 House and Studios.
You get your own private room with queen bed and access to our high-speed Wi-Fi, premium entertainment system, and more.
We'll even cook you breakfast. Look us up on Facebook at Delta 9 House.
That's facebook.com/Delta9House. Delta 9 House is booked through Airbnb.com. City of Portland permit number 17-159855. All right, welcome back, everybody. Time for our new segment, What in the News, where I get a chance to riff a little bit on what's happening in the latest headlines that we covered in the Cannabis Headline News. Kind of hearkening back to the old days of the Russ Belville Show when we had, actually before that, back to Normal Show Live, Cannabis Carey used to read the news, and then I got to react to it. And I kind of miss reacting to the stories of the day. Plus, I get to cram in a few extra stories here in this segment that didn't really fit in the official news. So here we go. Let's start with that story. Senator Cory Booker, who's rapidly turning out to be our champion in the Senate, cutting down this stupid, lazy stoner stereotype. Congratulations on doing that. And I think, one of the other quotes that he had in here that I thought was just perfect is that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing drugs harder than pot. Now, we know, right, that the last 3 presidents have smoked pot, right? Barack Obama smoked pot. George W. Bush smoked pot, was a little bit coy about it. He actually said to his biographer, I never answered the weed question. I never answered the marijuana question because I didn't want some little kid to do what I had done, right? So he kind of admitted it. Oh, and the person he admitted it to, his biographer, the guy's name was Douglas Weed. Seriously, W-E-A-D, but yeah, Douglas Weed. And then, of course, famously, Bill Clinton, I did not inhale. I did not like it. I did not inhale. Right? Remember Bill Clinton saying that. But Booker's pointing out they've done drugs harder than pot. 2 out of the last 3 presidents have done drugs harder than pot. We know Barack Obama admitted to using cocaine in his youth. And we know George W. Bush admitted to using cocaine in his youth. And I don't know, looking at Bill Clinton's nose and knowing what went on in Mena, Arkansas in the 80s, I got my suspicions about old Slick Willie, too. Nevertheless, the point should be made here when these the way that the subject had come up is that Slate's Mike Pesca was interviewing Booker and had made a suggestion that it would be a big ask to get pot smokers to help support legalization. A big ask because, we're so lazy, right? And that's when Booker went off on him. But I think it should be pointed out, we've legalized 8 states now. It's pretty obvious we're not that lazy. It's pretty obvious we're willing to get off the couch and go collect signatures and willing to talk to people about legalization, willing to head to the polls and vote for it. Stupid, lazy stoner stereotype. It's the most ridiculous thing. I mean, Richard Branson's a stoner. You couldn't think of a more successful guy, could you? Anyway, let's get to some other news stories that we had to breeze on past. A great little bit of data reported by Marijuana Moment. And if you haven't visited yet, go to marijuanamoment.net. They are just number 1 with a bullet right now. They're over 100,000 page views a month. They're just rising up the charts. But on Marijuana Moment, they point out that the new Pacific Northwest high-intensity drug trafficking area report is out. It's been leaked. And this new report, of course, this is the report where the drug cops try to make the case that, oh my God, legalization has ruined everything. Legalization has ruined everything. And everything's gone to hell in a handbasket, right? That's what they want you to believe. Well, according to their latest numbers that they've released, this is what they had to say about the current drug threats. In 2016, Washington State Senate Bill 5052 went into effect, and medical marijuana became subject to recreational marijuana regulation. While the state continues to adjust its marijuana laws, marijuana continues to represent 70% of overall treatment admissions for youth since the time of legalization in 2012. Okay, so think about that stat. If you find 10 kids in rehab, 7 of them are in rehab for pot. Since legalization, it still remains, right? It still continues to represent. So in other words, before legalization, 7 out of 10 kids in rehab are there for pot. After legalization, 7 in 10 kids in rehab are there for pot. So it doesn't look like legalizing marijuana had any significant effect on getting the kids addicted to the new pot 2.0 super hyper weed. And yet there's another stat that's interesting from this, especially in the context of this huge opiate overdose crisis we're dealing with. And that is youth opioid admissions. Youth opioid admissions. Now, this includes heroin, other opiates, oxycodone, hydrocodone, prescribed opiate substitutes, and non-prescription methadone, right? So this is the youth opioid admissions for Washington State. Did I mention this was Washington State numbers I was talking about? Yeah. So Washington State, in 2012, there's 410 kids in rehab for for opioids. In 2013, it was 310. And then it went back up. 2014, it's 480. 2015, it's 530. And now, in Washington State, in the height of the opiate overdose crisis, the number of kids admitted for opiates in the most recent year, 2016, was 90. Yeah. It went 310, 480, 530, and then dropped to 90. Do you suppose that fewer kids are taking weed? They're taking opiates now and smoking weed that it's legal? Could that have been what happened? No. Apparently, we got the same use amounts, right? They said that the 70% of the treatment admissions, it hasn't. Now, they don't want to talk too much about that, do they? They don't want to talk about decreasing opiate addiction as marijuana becomes more accepted, do they? Another story in the news, one of our favorites, the former Attorney General under President Bill Clinton, Dr. Joycelyn Elders. You remember her? She was the one who lost her job as Surgeon General for daring to suggest that we talk openly with our nation's children about masturbation. Oh no, you can't tell them about masturbation. So yeah, she has got a new interview out in Lenny online, lennyletter.com. And she says something in here about marijuana that really bugs me. Now, she's good on marijuana. She's pro-legalization and all that. But she says something that, and she says this often, and other people say this, and it bugs me every time I hear it. Let me just give you her quote. She's asked about Jeff Sessions and his retrograde attitude toward marijuana, as they put it. And she responds, former Surgeon General, responds, quote, let's see, where's the quote? Here it is. The same things keep going around and around and around. I wasn't the first nor the last health professional to take on these challenges. Because of marijuana, we have become the world's biggest jailer. We have criminalized a generation of young people for nothing and the less educated and poor. Okay, so my problem with the statement is because of marijuana, we have become the world's biggest jailer. I'm sorry. As appealing as that talking point is, it's not true. The criminalization of marijuana is not the sole blame for why we are the world's biggest jailer. In fact, it's a tiny, tiny proportion because, again, and our opponents say this, and we laugh it off, but it is true. Most people that get busted for possession of marijuana don't end up doing prison time. Now, yes, the people that produce it, the people that traffic it, the people that grow it and stuff, yeah, absolutely they do. But even they aren't a huge proportion. It's really more of all the rest of the drug crimes and mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws, right? My problem isn't necessarily that marijuana criminalization isn't helping to fill our prisons at some level, but it's the way that's phrased and framed that gives too easy an opportunity to our opponents to call bullshit on us. And once they attack our credibility in that way and are able to put, stats on the PowerPoint that show, no, we don't really have that many people in prison for marijuana, then it makes our job tougher. It's fine to talk about it as an element, as part of the mass incarceration crisis. But it's foolish and foolhardy, I think, to stand there and say, because of marijuana, we're the world's biggest jailer. It's just too easy to shoot down. And finally, one last little bit. We're following up on how Massachusetts had the honor of appointing the first cannabis activist to a regulatory body in Massachusetts. That would be Shailene Tidal, fantastic activist who was with SSDP and LEAP for a number of years. Well, now out here on the West Coast, we've taken our turn. Willamette Week's reporting that Governor Kate Brown is proposing a new council person, a new commissioner for the Oregon Liquor Control Commission. Now, that's also the commission that controls our cannabis here, right? And the fellow is Matt Miletus, or Miletus. I'm not sure how his name is pronounced. And he comes from a food and beverage industry family. So he'll be fine on the liquor side of Oregon Cannabis or Oregon Liquor Control Commission. But he's also someone who's been involved with developing Langdon Farms for marijuana farming. So someone who's in the marijuana industry is now a part of the 5-member commission that regulates the marijuana industry. Finally got one of our voices out there on the commission. So that's good news, I think. All right, stay tuned. When we come back, we'll have our Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. We're going back to the archives for an April interview when Trump was first talking about the opioid overdose crisis. But before we get to that, we'll have another one of our anti-drug public service announcements. A real ad. Stay tuned.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
If you work in the cannabis industry, consume marijuana, or just support freedom, you need to know about breaking policy news that affects you. Marijuana Moment is the daily newsletter that helps you stay on top of all the latest and most important state, federal, and international cannabis developments. Brought to you by longtime legalization activist Tom Angel, Marijuana Moment puts a concise yet comprehensive overview of cannabis news in your inbox early every weekday morning. Wake up to Marijuana Moment and rest assured you'll be ready for the cannabis news that's driving the day. Subscribe now at marijuanamoment.net.
The Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
There is nothing admirable, positive. There is nothing desirable about drugs.
Whatever you're smoking, it's not marijuana.
And now, in the interest of fair and balanced journalism, the Marijuana Agenda presents this anti-drug public service announcement.
Look at this. The marijuana can mess you up. Right. We've been getting high for what? 15 years? Nothing's ever happened. Did I get into all the drugs and start mugging people? Nah. Didn't do anything. In fact, I'd say I'm exactly the same as when I smoked my first joint.
Eddie, did you even look for a job today?
No, Ma.
Marijuana can make nothing happen to you, too.
To combat this sort of reefer madness, listen to the Marijuana Agenda every weekday at mjagenda.com. Hi, I'm Russ Belville from the Marijuana Agenda. If you're a cannabis brand looking to build trust and awareness within the community, consider becoming a sponsor of this program. Your message will be seen and heard by the most dedicated followers of marijuana policy reform, who are loyal and supportive of those brands that give back to the community. Just log on to mjagenda.com and click the Become a Patron button to learn how your brand can also be featured in my live nationwide appearances. Thank you for your support.
This is Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Dr. Earlywine is a professor of psychology at the State University of New York at Albany and author of numerous books and columns on cannabis science, culture, history, and medicine. Email your questions to Dr. Earlywine at 420research@gmail.com or call the Marijuana Agenda message line at 650-LEGAL-MJ. Now, here's your Cannabis Q&A.
All right, once again, it's time for our Cannabis Q&A with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. How you doing, Dr. Mitch?
Crazy day. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. And speaking of crazy, there's all sorts of things for us to go over today with regards to the opiate epidemic. This is the big talk of the town in Washington, D.C., with the President Trump putting together a opiate addiction crisis team composed of Governor Chris Christie, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, former Attorney General of Florida Pam Bondi, Governor Charlie Baker out of Massachusetts. I mean, this is an all-star lineup, Dr. Mitch. What do you think about this opiate task force?
I would have rather he just threw a dart at a map.
Not
because if you had a random sample of people, they couldn't be worse than this. Oh my God, Jeff Sessions, Chris Christie, are you kidding me? No, I'm pretty disappointed.
Not exactly who we'd want to see. The first bit on this I wanted to discuss has to do with CBS News report where they spoke with the DEA chief, Chuck Rosenberg, and the quote they get out of this is that opioids, quote, it scares the hell out of me. And they're making a big scare about the opiate epidemic. It reminds me of how in the 1980s there was the big scare about crack and crack babies, and that helped to depress support for marijuana reform. What do you make of the DEA head's comments, and do you think it will have a similar chilling effect like it did in the 80s?
I gotta admit, I think of the opiates as less alarming than crack. They're hitting the white people, though, and the wealthy people, so we better be super scared. I don't think the stats are off the way some of the crack baby stats were hitting the press in the 80s, but I gotta admit, call me paranoid stoner, I do think that the alarm about this, coupled with this nonsense we're hearing about how cannabis could help, or not help in that case, really does make me suspicious.
There was the reporter who did the story at CBS News. His Twitter account, Tony Ducapil is the man's name. He tweeted out after the report got, through social media, he tweeted out in response to it, I also asked DEA Chief Chuck Rosenberg if marijuana legalization had pushed the cartels toward more heroin sales. His response, maybe. Is there a fear here that if we took marijuana away from the cartels, so now that they're responding by upping the production of heroin?
Well, they sure as fuck ain't growing coffee.
I guess not.
I mean, if they're going to cut out, somebody's main source of economic good life, I can't imagine they wouldn't either turn to coca or opiates. And right now, opiates certainly seem to have a market.
The other concern here is how they're trying to tie the idea of this opiate epidemic as being part and parcel with the problem of the gateway drug. Marijuana is this gateway drug that's leading people to that. I have a clip here that I wanted to play, and we'll get your take on this. This was at that opiate crisis key hearing that took place the other day, and this was the mother talking to President Trump, Governor Christie, and Attorney General Sessions.
Unfortunately, my son OD'd after having been clean for 10 and a half months, OD'd on a drug that was laced with fentanyl. So he died.
Which is getting worse and worse. I hear
Yes.
Getting just out of control.
So Carlos started smoking marijuana when he was 15 and a half years old, and for him, and he'd be the first to tell you this, it's absolutely for him a gateway drug. It led to heroin, cocaine, crystal meth. At 18, when he was a senior in high school, with months to graduate, he had a crystal meth overdose.
So how can we respond, when a mother is speaking like that from the heart about her dead son and calls out the gateway drug theory? How do we respond without coming off as crass or insensitive?
That's just it. So we have to begin with an acknowledgement that we're all absolutely, despondent about her loss. And we definitely are on the same page as far as wanting to prevent drug-related harm. That said, generalizing from a single case about literally anything may not be very logical. For every kid who started at 15 and a half and ended up on heroin, I know a kid who started at 15 and a half and ended up going to college, paying taxes, and living a delightful life. So the fact that we don't get to weigh those cases as heavily as her case shows a logical error that is hard to explain, in part because public schools are so poorly funded. So this really is part of a much bigger educational problem, and I do feel like, as heartfelt as all that stuff sounds, it really doesn't hold up if you think about, would I generalize about a single case to anything? And that may be our way to finally get inside people's heads about this.
One last bit on the opiate crisis here. We've been touting the stats recently, the studies, the surveys that have shown fewer opiate overdose, fewer deaths, fewer prescriptions in the states with medical marijuana access. But now comes across my desk the study that says women with opioid addiction who use cannabis will do worse in methadone treatment. This seems pretty complex. I wanted to get your take on it.
Yeah, and unfortunately what we're really seeing here is cannabis use may be a proxy for low socioeconomic status on these kinds of things. So I'm not crystal clear if they covariated these things out correctly, and I'm quite sure these women weren't randomly assigned to use cannabis. So I'm afraid what they're finding here is that a subset of women who happen to be poor and using cannabis are probably driving this effect to make it look like they're less likely to do well in the opiate methadone-based treatment programs.
Interesting. All right, let's shift gears now from the look at the opiate epidemic to the use of medical cannabis to help our veterans who are suffering from PTSD. We've covered the story of Dr. Sue Sisley going through the trials and tribulations along with Rick Doble and the folks at MAPS to be able to get the first FDA-approved study of whole plant cannabis for veterans with PTSD. The news we get today, some sad news, Johns Hopkins school was part of this test, and now they've dropped out. And I was wondering if you could tell us any more about that and what this may do to hamper or delay the testing.
I mean, the sad part is every university relies heavily on federal funds, and they're all peeing in their pants right now wondering what do they have to do in order to hang on to that cash. And right now, Hopkins is trying to play it safe in hopes of not infuriating the National Institute of Health and basically the whole Trump administration, so they can hang on to what are literally millions of dollars that have been funding their research for the last few decades. And I understand the playing it safe, but I had really hoped they would take a stand here because this has already been approved by the ethics boards. The funding is not federal funding. There's independence as far as these labs are concerned when it comes to doing this. And the empirical support is as close as it could be without being definitive proof. We've got tons of really outrageous self-report data that just suggests that, without this plant, a lot of these guys would have committed suicide by now. And compelling work from my lab and labs all around the country saying, look, the key symptoms that are problematic for PTSD definitely respond well to specific strains of cannabis. So it just breaks my heart, and the fact that it's really all about the cash makes me extra disappointed.
So with Hopkins out, they were the ones on the East Coast, like Baltimore, I think it was. This just leaves Arizona school, is that correct?
There was going to be some work at University of Pennsylvania, and basically the guy who was on that faculty, I'm understanding that he's, experiencing a lot of frustration with trying to get this kind of work done, and they end up working for, some California or Oregon cannabis company instead to, try to do the sort of thing he wants to do and make a decent living.
Wow. All right. Now, also with respect to that story of Dr. Sisley and the PTSD study, she had complained that the cannabis she was receiving from the University of Mississippi, Dr. El Soli's pot farm there, was substandard, not high enough THC, was laden with all sorts of gunk and nasty stuff that they didn't want to give to the veterans. And now there's been a response, an op-ed that was published that says the criticism of the University of Mississippi marijuana's quality was unfair. I've seen it, Dr. Mitch. What do you think?
I mean, if Irvin's is any indicator, it is not anywhere near as good as the cheapest trash I've seen in Washington State. So I really don't know what he's saying about these 27 varieties. And you'll note that nowhere in that op-ed does he say, by the way, here's our percent THC. Because last I heard, they had an 8% strain, and they were acting like it was God's gift to cannabis, when I really doubt there's a dispensary in town that is selling anything as low as 8%.
Oh, the 8%. Wasn't that my father's Woodstock weed that Kevin Sabet's always telling me about?
Sad but true.
My goodness. All right, a final bit of science here, but before we close things up, I want to remind everyone that if you want to get your questions directly to Dr. Mitch, you can do so through email by emailing 420research@gmail.com, 420research@gmail.com. This last story, interesting for us science nerds, that the scientists have cracked the code, the genetic code of terpenes in the cannabis plant. I'm just wondering, aside from this being cool from a nerd perspective, what does this mean for consumers? Are we going to get more standardization, maybe get away from strain names and such?
It wouldn't surprise me if we also have some pretty good indication ahead of time of whether this is going to be a laughing strain, a pain strain, a sedating strain, a stimulating strain, simply because we'll know, is it linalool, is it limonene? We'll at least have a good guess for how's it going to smell and how's it going to taste.
Well, that's good news. One of the considerations I've always had is that, when I travel the country, if I stop into a Subway sandwich shop, I know what I can get. It's generally the same ingredients, but from state to state, when you're shopping for marijuana, it's different from state to state, different even from strain to strain.
This episode was produced as part of the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville, the daily news and interview podcast covering the world of medical cannabis, adult marijuana, industrial hemp, and spiritual ganja. MJAgenda.com.
New beginner guitars and banjos are often constructed much better than ones built before your time. Why struggle? Get a new instrument or fix the old one. The trusted professionals at the Fingerboard Extension will evaluate your instrument for free. Repairs are priced for people who work for a living. Stop by the Fingerboard Extension downtown Corvallis at 120 Northwest 2nd Street today, or check out its inventory on the web at fingerboardextension.com.
You're listening to the Marijuana Agenda with Russ Belville.
Hey, this is Willie Nelson, or Normal, and I smoke pot and I like it a lot. I learned a long time ago that marijuana is a lot safer than alcohol. There's nothing wrong with the responsible use of marijuana by adults. It's time we stopped arresting and started respecting those who smoke marijuana responsibly. To learn what you can do to help, contact Normal at norml.org or call toll-free 888-67-NORMAL.
Total war against public enemy number one.
10 federal criminal penalties for up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
Marijuana is probably the most dangerous drug.
Legalization is just another word for surrender.
I experimented with marijuana and didn't inhale.
This is not medicine. This is a Cheech and Chong show.
Encourage people to use less drugs.
I inhale. That was the point.
I think it would be a mistake to legalize.
Negative reports coming out of Colorado.
Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Radical Rant.
There isn't a week that goes by where I'm not reading some article, blog, or comment from someone in the cannabis community who hates how marijuana legalization is proceeding. It's destroyed medical marijuana. It's wiping out the mom and pops. It's all a bunch of white guys getting rich. Now, those comments largely come from the production and distribution side of what's been called the black market. I don't think there are too many of us on the consumer side that are longing for a return to the days of visiting the ATM at odd hours so we can then wait in the parking lot for the guy who's 30 minutes late with the overpriced baggie of Got Some that's a gram short, followed by the trepidation of driving home carefully with the smell of an arrest in our pocket. But indeed, every state that has provided an exception to criminal prosecution for the production and sale of cannabis for medical purposes has now scaled back those programs since the production and sale of cannabis for any purpose is legal. And yes, the states that have legalized have established difficult to insurmountable barriers to entry for those who have already been producing and distributing in the cannabis economy. And as is the case with almost everything capitalism touches, its face is a white male. See, the problem is that we legalized marijuana. We didn't legalize what people were already doing with marijuana. See, too many people believed that legalizing marijuana meant everything we're already doing with marijuana stays exactly the same, except the cops are out of the picture. And sorry, that's never what legalization meant. It's not what legalization could even possibly mean. I mean, first of all, even if we could have just magically erased the cops from the picture, what we were already doing with marijuana was going to change. Those mom and pops we wax nostalgic about are, in reality, unlicensed, unregulated small businesses, artificially supported by a prohibition price subsidy and artificially protected from big box store competition by a prosecution tariff. With the cops out of the picture, there'd have been nothing restricting anybody, especially well-capitalized white guys, from growing more and more and more cannabis, flooding the market to the point where no mom-and-pop cannabis farmer could compete. In other words, like now, but only faster. At least now in the States, there are limits on how many retailers there can be, right? How many licenses, and how much marijuana they can sell, right? They can only sell an ounce at a time to all their potential customers. Look, weed is already down to $79 an ounce specials here in Portland. And that's with about 200 retail stores and a sale limit of 1 ounce per customer in a city of roughly 80,000 tokers. Imagine how low that price would get if unlimited growers could grow as much cannabis as they wanted to for sale to people who could buy and hoard as much cannabis as they wanted. Just take a second and imagine the vision of people hauling out $100 bales of cannabis on a cart from the Costco. Yeah. Now, second, if marijuana were completely no limits legal, as magically erasing the cops would make it, then there's no need whatsoever for a medical marijuana program. What would the program be protecting patients from when there are no cops to worry about? Now, I'm for that, by the way, this idea of no limits legalization. No patient would ever have to suffer. No toker would ever have to go to jail. But don't think for a second that you could make a living growing a few plants in a closet and selling them for $300 an ounce under that paradigm. Third, consider what the effect would have been on the whole nation if a state or states passed no limits legalization. You think the cops in the cross-state border counties are complaining now about the flow of weed from legal states? Imagine that times the $100 Costco bail I mentioned earlier. Look, there's no way that we would have had an Obama administration turning a blind eye to legalization in that scenario, much less a Trump administration and Jeff Sessions just sitting on the sidelines. So, the way legalization is unfolding now is pretty much the way legalization had to proceed. But that doesn't mean we can't improve it. Remove those barriers to entry for previously convicted people. Create micro-business licenses that essentially legalize being a one-man weed grower/dealer. Prioritize the licensing for people who've been previously convicted. This works to address the disproportionate impact the drug war has had on people of color without being an explicitly racial affirmative action program that might face more opposition. No matter how you slice it, though, folks, the days of the $2,000 wholesale pound and the $300 retail ounce are history. No matter how shakily we're taking the first steps into legalization, legalization is still a far better place than prohibition. Unless, I suppose, you were profiting off prohibition. That's all the time we got for today. Thanks for joining us. Be back tomorrow with more news and views. And until next time, take care of each other, tokers.
Follow MJ Agenda on Facebook, Pinterest, Instagram, YouTube, and follow MJ Agenda Show on Twitter. Learn more at mjagenda.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed. seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant